Hi, I'm Craig Dumont with PentecostalPastor.com, and with me today is Dr. Mark Barber, pastor of McDonald United Methodist Church, McDonald, Tennessee. Mark, hey, listen, it's Holy Week. You're still joining us on a Monday afternoon. Great to have you here. I know that you're busy, but we're walking our way through the book of Matthew. I think we're at chapter 11 today, correct?
A little for 11 and 10.
Oh, okay.
11, verse 10.
Oh, okay. Well,
we
great.
already started chapter
okay.
11 after 50 some videos, or almost 60, whatever.
Yeah. I think this is 57.
Oh, wow. Anyway, welcome. And we're going to be talking about a little passage that begins in verse, I should say, it's verse 20. I maybe can't even read my little small print here. It says, then, no, I'm sorry. Let's try verse 16.
Okay.
I'm getting ahead of myself. It says, "But what shall I like in this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions and saying, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating or drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children." We talked about starting being in chapter 11, the last video. We talked about John the Baptist, who should have been the most stalwart of Jesus' supporters.
Right.
After having been in jail, was wondering whether he had made a mistake in identifying Jesus. It's kind of an understandable thing, considering his life was on the line, and he had to be sure, because he was about to lose his head.
Yeah.
And he sent two of his disciples, which is kind of strange. And maybe his disciples shamed him into going, because why would John have any disciples left? They should have all followed Jesus. There shouldn't be any disciples of John the Baptist anymore. They should have, listened to, and like the other, like John and I guess Peter or John and Andrew, whatever it was, that the two of the disciples left off and followed Jesus, including the beloved disciple. Could have been John, his brother. I don't know which is John to somebody.
Right.
And there shouldn't be disciples left, because John's mission was to introduce the bridegroom, and then it was the bridegroom's job, according to the Gospel of John, for the bridegroom to get out of the way. And John was still baptizing even in chapter 3, and people were complaining of John and saying, why are you still baptizing all these people? Or that Jesus is actually baptizing more people than you are. Why is he still baptizing people? His job of baptism is over. He's introduced the bridegroom, and God soon takes him out of the way. Now, I don't want to pick too hard on John the Baptist, because I said last week that there's nobody ever greater born among women than John the Baptist. So it just shows you even the prophets of God are fallible. And
Well, Mark, I hadn't really thought a lot about this, but could it be that Mark just continued? That John continued just baptizing, waiting for Jesus to say, hey, time is now stopped. Because it was almost like there was a continuation of John's work pointing to Jesus even as he was out. I don't know.
We don't know. Yeah. We do has the famous statement, he must increase
and I must
decrease. But there was, I guess he had a lot of ministry supporters that didn't quite see things that way. I wanted to keep the ministry going. After all, he was the one that came in this parable, the one that came with a funeral dirge.
Right.
He came neither eating or drinking. He was dressed in camel hair suit, and he was eating honeycomb and wild locusts and honey. And he didn't cut his hair, he didn't bathe,
Right.
He was truly living the rough life. And yet it says, for the most part, that Israel did not accept his ministry. Yes, who came? The sinners and the ones that the soldiers even came, which does that mean Roman soldiers that came for baptism? I don't know, but there's a lot of people who came. But in the long run, John the Baptist is alone without very many friends in jail.
Right.
And he's out of the picture.
Yeah.
And Jesus has come and take his place. And every place Jesus goes, there's a feast when a sinner's converted. There's that feast of Matthew, and he's converted, and and of course Luke is full of all the different feasts.
Right.
And they accuse Jesus of being a glutton and a wine bibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So he plays, he says this little ditty, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. That's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
We mourned to you, and you did not lament. That was John the Baptist. And then it's in a reverse part of what's called a chiastic structure, I suppose. John came neither eating nor drinking. They say he has a demon. The Son of Man comes drinking and eating and drinking. They say, look, a glutton and a wine bibber.
Right.
And John is crazy. He has a demon. Now that's bad. They're saying that basically, and it's not just the Pharisees who sent people out to question him. It's not just the Sadducees. What you're seeing here is the start of the rejection of the Jewish people of the message of Jesus. He was healing, and he was really, really popular for a short time. And starting with chapter 11, you start to see the great falling away from Jesus, from the people that should have been the most loyal, down to the people who never were convinced, the Pharisees, and finally the Sadducees were probably at the very least of all the ones that you'd expect to hear the gospel. Of course, the very least that the Jews expected to hear would have been tax collectors and sinners. But guess who was listening? The tax collectors and the sinners.
Yeah.
And maybe that kind of, rejection is because they expected the Messiah to come to the good.
Yeah.
And the ones that were prepared, and would judge these tax collectors, sinners, and even the people of the land, the people that despised the law of Moses, and he was going to burn them up in a heap. And instead, they're the ones that listen to the tune. They're the ones that dance to the flute. Can you imagine? You talk about dancing in some churches. Woo! But Jesus was, kind of the Lord of the dance, if I can put it that way. And he didn't meet the expectations. So the people who were from the most conservative, it's that new worship stuff.
Yeah.
We want to do things the old way. And
he was like the original John Wesley preaching in open fields.
Yes.
Or even Whitfield preaching. Actually, Whitfield preceded Wesley in preaching in the open field. So obviously they did what Jesus did. But
and they got some of the same kind of reaction. Of course, I would think John Wesley and George Whitfield probably were a little closer to the John the Baptist model than they were the Jesus model, may I add. But nevertheless, you start seeing that kind of rejection, and Jesus even prepares his disciples for that before it actually happens. Remember, they go on a preaching tour, and it's a great smash success. So we read about Luke, these demons are coming out. We really got it.
Yeah.
And but here in Matthew, the emphasis is upon that he's preparing anybody that's going to be a follower of Jesus to have the exact same reception. And you look at Paul. Paul goes to a city. He goes into the synagogue. Let's take Antioch in Pisidia as an example. And the Jews hear him gladly. They're all excited. They bring the whole town the next week. And then he starts telling the Gentiles have equal say. And again, then his message to the Gentiles. And all of a sudden, in a few days, he's run out of town. And then they chase him down. They chase him down over 100 miles of pretty desolate ground to a little tiny town called Lystra, and incite the people to stone him, even though he has just done a tremendous miracle, and they were ready to do sacrifice to him as a god. The next minute, they're stoning the fellow. You see what I'm saying? And that pattern repeats itself again and again and again. And the same thing happened to Jesus. That Jesus had, at first, he electrified the people, because he thought he's our Jesus, but he's not the sinner's Jesus. He's not the tax collector's Jesus. He's our Jesus. And he's going to throw away. And we know a lot of our religious leaders are corrupt, and he's going to probably clean house with them too. I mean, they would have been much happy to see the temple cleansed and things of that nature. But and Jesus would have one more big round of popularities. He comes into, of course, on Palm Sunday, whatever. Yeah. But I'm saying that fundamentally there is a change in the weather. Starting even in chapter 10, and it goes on there. Before, he's just attacking the Pharisees. A lot of people were glad he attacked the Pharisees because the Pharisees were
attacked everybody else.
Well, the Pharisees were kind of hypocritical.
Right.
They thought they're the only ones that were good enough. Mm-hmm. But these people here in Galilee, as a whole, tended to be pretty conservative. And it says, and Jesus knows their heart. Maybe they're still cheering him on. But there's, Jesus knows there's a change. Mm-hmm. And he says, that, and he just says this little thing about, we tried it by mourning and we tried it by dancing, and you just don't get it. And when he says John is got a demon, John the Baptist, in a sense, he's not acting out of himself. He's not really responsible for what he does. He's just mad. Mm-hmm. He's demon-possessed, and it's really Satan doing it. But when they call Jesus a glutton and a wine-bibber, if you go back, and this is through Dr. Brendan Whitty, anyway, he talks about this. And he says that in the book of Deuteronomy, when you had a child that was incorrigible, mm-hmm. that had been admonished, yet was still drunk, mm-hmm. and still gluttonous, and rebellious, you would take him out and execute him. Mm-hmm. And the people of the house, the oldest brother to father, was to cast the very first stone. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is rejected, as you know, in the end of the gospel, by his own people and put to death as a blasphemer. Mm-hmm. Now that wouldn't hold weight with the Russians, right? Romans. The Romans, needed something like sedition and treason, mm-hmm. and they manufactured that. But they wanted to get rid of Jesus because he says, "You blaspheme. You claim that you are the Son of God." I could just see that they shut their ears, and all the Sanhedrin voted and condemned him, mm-hmm. on the spot on his own testimony. What need have we of further testimony? The high priest rips his robe, does all this dramatic stuff. Mm-hmm. And it says there, we're going to clean our own house of this fella. Mm-hmm. He is a glutton and a wine-bibber, and we need to put this embarrassment out of Israel. Because if we let this continue, then God is going to throw us out of our country again. We've already been exiled and tasted the bitter dregs, and we have learned our lesson, and we shall not be exiled again. And they didn't know by their very rejection that they sentenced themselves to another exile.
So it's interesting because you mentioned, is it Dr. Whitty?
Yes.
That talked about him being the rebellious son. Mm-hmm. I think that that's a really powerful point. I was thinking, now I hadn't read his material. I know N.T. Wright makes some points about that, being that they had accused him of being a rebellious child. I think that there's a huge amount that you could actually unpack from that in terms of what they were doing and what that meant as Jesus was trying to recapitulate everything that was going on. I'm not an expert in all those areas, but I'd like to, at some point as we get through this, I'd like to come back and talk more about that, because I'd like to kind of, we have a little bit more time in that particular area. I'd like to unpack that, because I think that there's a huge amount that we could talk about when you talk about what they were accusing Jesus of, really. I mean, when you scratch below the surface and maybe read it again.
Yes, of course, he got the Pharisees mad, and it's, you had the fake news press back then.
Yeah, well, that's been happening since Adam and Eve and the serpent lying to them.
Yes, but anyway, this is you see this transition. It picks up, I guess, with the next little piece of this passage, which we'll we cover because it's related to it.
Yeah, Mark, isn't it interesting? I know I'm kind of taking off a little bit, but you mentioned about him, that he was, what did you say, the Lord of the dance? Another person said he was the Lord of the banquet. All signifying this celebratory, joyful approach to life, right? Because
Right.
the king, and of course Jesus, when the disciples, or when the Pharisees came to Jesus, they were condemning the disciples. They were saying, why don't they fast? Why don't they this way? And he said, hey, listen, can they fast while the bridegroom was with them? In other words, where Jesus was, there was joy.
Yes.
And so Jesus, this fullness of life, this abundance, and this overflowing table, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. My cup runneth over. All of that, that's some powerful testimony towards the joy of the Lord, which is our strength. And yet, I think you and I have talked a few times. I don't know if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know that from my perspective, Pastor, I think one of the things that we've missed in evangelical circles is this joy, this celebration. I just think that, if Jesus was in our midst and came eating and drinking, we would be the same as the Pharisees. We'd call him a wine bibber and a glutton. Don't eat this, don't do that, deny this, deny that. It's just really how we've taken all the joy of fellowship out of the good news.
This is Monday of Holy Week.
Yeah.
On Thursday, or so we think, it's hard to sometimes the chronology to be in 3 days, 3 nights, third day things some say it might be Thursday rather than Friday, and so forth. We call a day we call a Good Friday, or it could even been Wednesday night. We don't know because of the way the calendar works. But Jesus sat down to eat the Passover.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Passover had two components to it. First of all, it was a roasted lamb,
Mm-hmm.
and there was lots of food.
Right.
There was at least 4 cups of wine that were passed around,
Mm-hmm.
The table at Passover time. It was a time of great joy and a great celebration, but there was also the bitter herbs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about Jesus, he says, take, eat, this is my body, and drink, this is my blood. We remember the bitterness at the communion, at the Maundy Thursday service.
Mm-hmm.
But we forget the words of Jesus. I'll drink this cup anew with you in the kingdom of God.
All right. Yeah.
So you're going to have sadness for tonight, but and they're going to be glad.
Yeah.
But it's going to
Weeping may
change.
endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning.
And they psalm piece, isn't that?
Yeah,
From Psalms. I think it's Psalms.
It is, yeah.
And so when we look at this, we have to understand, yes, there's bitterness on the cross, but there's also the promise that bitterness is past.
Uh-huh.
And what should have happened with Passover is thinking of past bitterness and the present joy of eating. And by the way, when they ate the first Passover, they ate it standing up.
Right, because
with the shoes on their feet.
Right, yeah.
But when the time they got to Jesus, they ate it lying down,
Right.
in Roman style.
Now that transition actually came in the Old Testament after they left. Wasn't that a command? You did eat it there because you were moving out, but now you're going to eat it in peace, right?
When you got into the land.
So it wasn't just a tradition in Jesus' day. This is actually a command by God.
Yes, well, yes.
Right.
But
okay.
but
right.
But
by
they
the time they get it, they're
when they entered into the land, because
Right.
then you're remembering God has been good to His promises.
Absolutely.
So you're looking ultimately at the Passover, and I think the Lord's Supper is ultimately is at the joy and remembrance of the past bitterness, but living in the now is that it is now no longer standing, it is seated. The work has been done. And that's the same way Jesus is seated high priest as compared to the standing high priest of the Old Testament. It's the idea that we have now received rest in Jesus. And so when we talk about the idea of the banquet, is that Christians should feast. It's I think a requirement, and also that part of the feast also means that we have to be willing to prepare all our fellowship suppers in the church ought to be feasts.
Mm-hmm.
And they ought not just a little cracker and a little sip of juice.
Right.
They should be feast because you are anticipating the kingdom.
Right. In fact, I probably am on, I don't want to, at this point, defend my position too strong, but, where Malachi says, bring in the tithes, there may be food in my house. Of course, with the tithes in the Old Testament, half of them were eaten by the people that brought them. I mean, they would bring the tithes,
Yes.
and then they would actually consume
Eat them in the presence of in the place where the Lord has commanded you.
Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
So that would be, I think that this idea.
And you shall
of
eat your
having-
full. And you shall eat your full.
Yeah.
That's what it says. You
Yep.
shall eat your full.
Absolutely.
And you should be merry.
Well, if we were to talk about the church using part of its tithe to throw feasts for people, boy, people would have a heart attack today.
Well, you have to at least consider that. Consider that for the people of God and the people within your church, because you're anticipating the kingdom of heaven and the joy and the banquet, and you should do your best to anticipate it in everything you do, whether it's the church
absolutely.
fellowship supper or whether it's the worship service or whatever we do. It's the emphasis is upon the bitterness is past.
Yeah.
Our sins have been forgiven.
Yeah.
Christ is risen.
Yeah.
And we take maybe a little bit of time where we remember the words of institution, as Paul mentions us, say, 1 Corinthians 11. But the idea is,
that was one aspect of it. I mean, the early
but
church.
then they may have had that. But also, his complaint was, well, some people bought a lot of food.
Yeah.
And they sat in ranks, social ranks.
Yeah.
And some people ate a ton of food, and other people went away hungry. Where it was the benefactor's job to see everybody was fed. It did not matter. Social rules didn't say everybody had to eat the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would, you could eat a lot more. But you just had to provide wine and bread, basic wine and bread to everybody, or better.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there were certain groups that got better, and some of them were actually drunk, and others were fat, and others went away hungry. And sometimes we think, well, we have spiritual eating now, and we're discerning the body of the Lord, right? Because all we got's a little cracker and a cup. But then we don't realize, well, discerning the body means that there are people out there that are hungry.
Yeah.
There are people out there that are thirsty. We are gathered together in churches in groups based on social rank. We have middle-class churches. We got rich churches. We got black churches. We got white churches. We've got all kinds of churches under the sun, and we're not sharing the same table together. And we're just as guilty as the Corinthians are, for example. That says, okay, if that's going to be bread and cracker, a little cracker and juice for everybody, that's better than not recognizing the body properly at all. But it would be better to recognize it. He who God has blessed, bring a feast and share it.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that's spiritually rich, let him share it.
Right.
And let everybody in the congregation be glad, just like in the Feast of Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, the children of Israel here rejected that. They reject, of course, austerity, and then they reject you if you're the other way around. If you're, too much, if you're a spendthrift, if you're a wastrel. It's almost like, you can't win no matter what you do.
Yeah.
And
by the way, I'm just going to throw in a little plug. I'm actually going to be doing a series. Hopefully it's up by the time this gets out, on the theology of feasting. I've already written one part of the newsletter. I'm actually doing a second part, but that whole idea on the theology of feasting is so important today. And actually, you've kind of tracked, I haven't written it yet, but you've tracked along with my thoughts on some of what you were talking about in terms of, the church coming together and eating. That's an important aspect of this. So maybe
everything,
I'll have to get you to help me write that second part of the
everything the
newsletter.
church does
Yeah.
is anticipatory.
Yeah.
You are modeling the kingdom to come.
Yeah.
And that is whether it's in the worship service, whatever acts of ministry we do, we're doing anticipating. And that's why I'm saying that, they're going to call me the preacher who talks about the fellowship supper. Well, I do like to eat, and that's obvious, but at the same time, the scriptural thing, the idea is that the abundance of hospitality.
Yes.
It reflects that one day we're going to feast at that table with the Lord.
Uh-huh.
And we're going to make merry.
Yeah.
It's going to be a great time. Well, I was going to do a second half of this passage, but I think we'll wait to the next video to do it simply
Okay.
because, like usual, we have tracked
That's
a
okay.
little bit off
Yeah.
the beaten path, but
Yeah.
not too far.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark.
Okay.